as a family, reflecting on our year away, I think one of the things that has really struck us is, in many ways, how quickly the year has seemingly gone by. It was certainly slow at times. There were certainly challenges at times. But as we reflect and we look back, I realize from where I am standing, we owe you an incredible thank you. Thank you on behalf of our family for affording us this opportunity to go away for a year. And the thank you is not just for the going away, but in the letting us come back. I talked to the other guy who was up here on Sunday mornings, and I said, listen, around May and June, start to lag a little bit, don't do such a good job. And the guy doesn't listen to me in anything, right? But thank you on behalf of our family. It was a great learning experience for us as a family. It was great for us to be involved in different ministries. And I'm sure it's a year that we're just going to continue to be able to reflect upon and to just learn and to discover, what God was doing in our lives. And it was incredible to know the support we had while we were over there, and to receive people's emails and know that people were praying for us, and we tried to stay connected as best we could as well. But thank you. It was an incredible year, and it was a gift that was given to us by all of you. Also, thank you from the National Church. We didn't know quite exactly what we would be stepping into in terms of our roles, but it was a great year in terms of restoring relationships with our national partner in Malawi. It was great for us to be exposed to different ministries, and I believe that as a national church, as we look specifically into what is happening in Malawi, we've built stronger relationships, and we have an opportunity to kind of continue to build upon those. And so thank you from all of them. And so I thought for these next couple of weeks, I said earlier, to kind of try to share a little bit about what we were doing. So this week I'm going to talk a little bit about what I was involved in primarily. Next week Rebecca's going to join me up here, and she's going to talk about what she was doing as well. Because, I kind of liken it to sometimes if you have kids and your kids come home after having been away for a week or having been away for a weekend, and you sometimes get two polar opposite responses. You have the one child that comes in, and before the door closes, they're just telling you everything, and everything's going on, and everything was awesome, everything's wonderful, and you're like, oh, dial it back a bit, all right? We don't want to be that type of child. But at the same time, I don't want to be a child where you walk through the door and say, so how was your week away? Good. What'd you do? Stuff. Right? We don't want to be that person as well. So we're going to try to find the middle ground here. And so this week I'm going to talk about what I was up to. And essentially it was boiled down into two primary responsibilities. One is I was attached to a congregation in Blantyre, and primarily as the English-speaking pastor, which meant I wasn't overly involved during the week. I would help out with some funerals and some weddings, the occasional visiting as well. But primarily I was involved in the Sunday morning service. And get this, English service in Malawi, 6 a.m. start. 6 a.m. start. So all you who show up late for 10:30, no sympathy from me. No sympathy at all. I was like, we thank God for many different things. I'm like, thank God for 10:30 service start time. I can get into that. But my primary responsibility was being involved in prison ministry. And it was a bit of a coming home for me in many ways, because as some of you may know, 9 years ago we were in Malawi. And what started was a very basic Bible study in one of the local prisons that I had started about 10 years ago. And it was great to be able to go back and to see ministry happening not only in that prison in Blantyre, but now starting to reach out into other prisons, where now there is a full-time chaplain. There's a group of volunteers between 10 to 12 people who desire to visit regularly and as often as they can. In Malawi, there's 21 prisons in the southern region with about 13,000 inmates. And so, as a church, we're wanting to step into this void and begin ministry with them. And so when I returned Monday to Friday, I would visit prisons, and I visited primarily 4 different prisons. The furthest one away would be about an hour and a half. Other prisons, I visited 18 of the 21 prisons at different times throughout the year doing different things. But primarily my week was spent going to 4 different prisons. And it was at my very first visit that in many ways it set the theme for my year. Have you ever found yourself about to have a conversation with someone, and you're pretty sure the conversation is going to go one way, and then the other person responds and it goes completely the other way, and you find yourself a little unprepared? Well, that's probably the best way for me to describe how my first visit at the prison went. I went in already thinking, we're going to study the book of Philippians. Now, for those of you not as familiar, Philippians is a New Testament written by the Apostle Paul. And Paul has an interesting history, because before he became a follower of Jesus, he was one of the great persecutors of Christians. He would hunt them down, he would put them in prison, he would watch agreeing with their death in the streets. And then Jesus got hold of his life and used him to be essentially God's mouthpiece at the birth of the early church. And it's in the book of Philippians, which is actually a letter that Paul is writing near the end of his life, get this, while he's in prison, to a bunch of Christians that he had met in a city called Philippi. And so I thought, what a great place to start. Here is a guy who has a past, who was changed by God, and is now doing incredible things. And so for my very first Bible study with these inmates, who most of them all had a past, who had done things they had regretted, had perhaps wondered, could God really use them? I thought, I'm going to hone in on about the 5th sentence of this first letter of Paul with these words. Paul says, "Be confident of this, that he," speaking of God, "who has started a good work in you, will carry it on to completion." My paraphrase goes like this: be confident that when God starts something in you, he's not finished with you yet because of Jesus Christ. And I thought, what a great place to start for these men, to speak into the reality of how God can be at work in their life. But guess what? God obviously had other plans, because we never even got to that verse. You see, the first part of the letters, when you say you write a letter, you don't just jump into the bulk of the material. Okay, maybe I'm dating myself a little bit. Some of you may still write letters. But back in the day, I can't believe I'm so old, I'm saying back in the day. Back in the day when you'd write letters, you'd write greetings, and you do an introduction, and you go that way. And it's in the very first part of Paul's letter to the church in Philippi that he writes this greeting that I've read many, many times and skimmed over many, many times, but that's exactly where we landed. Because in the second sentence, the 3rd verse, Paul says this: "I give thanks to God every time I remember you." You know what the prisoners in the Blantyre prison wanted to talk about? Is one of their greatest fears, and that is being forgotten. And so when they heard these words, for some of them the very first time, that they could be remembered in prayer, there was a sense of overwhelming hope. And if anyone had reason to believe that they could be easily forgotten, it were these guys. People ask me, what is prison life like? In one word, awful. Typically, the prisons I would visit would be incredibly overcrowded. The one in Blantyre, where I visited every Tuesday morning, was built for 900 men. Every Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock when I'd walk through those gates, there would be upwards of 1,800 to 2,100 men. They would be in cells that would be so tight that they physically could not lie down to sleep. They'd have to hunch up in balls or just take turns or do whatever it took. They would be locked in their cells from 4 o'clock at night until 7 a.m. in the morning. So you can start to imagine, just begin to throw in the reality of lack of food, lack of water, basic hygiene. You can start to realize why these men felt as if they had been forgotten by society. But that wasn't the biggest issue for them. You see, the biggest issue was the feeling that they had been forgotten by their family. Every week we'd spend about 2.5 hours, and at the end we'd always spend time in prayer. And the number one prayer request, without fail, every week, was these men asking that their families would visit them, that their families would not forget them. You see, families were a vital component of their survival in prisons, not just for their physical and their material needs, because they would need it in terms of extra food and extra clothing and sometimes basic medicine and other necessities, but also just the emotional need as well, to know that you have people out there caring for you. Now, sometimes these family members would unintentionally not be able to come and visit, primarily because sometimes people would be arrested in the night and the family wouldn't know where they were, or there would be a lot of transfers throughout the year and they'd be transferred to other prisons and they wouldn't even know where their loved ones were. And so a bunch of our time was spent through advocacy, just trying to link families with their loved ones in prison. But you can't forget that Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world. And so even if they knew where their loved one was, having the resources to get there and to visit them on a regular basis when they could barely even feed themselves, it just wasn't happening. And then, of course, some family members chose not to visit because the shame that was brought upon the family or the community by their actions. And so these men worried that they had been forgotten. And then the final leap is then as you come in and you start to speak into their lives about the reality of God, some of them, because of their external circumstances, felt that they too had been forgotten by God. But isn't that some of the human condition? You'll see up here, this is a picture of Chichiri Prison. This is the prison in Blantyre, about 5 minutes away from our home. This is during one of the Bible studies that we had for them. We would have upwards between 40 and 120 men attend based on just a number of different factors. You can roll through to the next one. This is Makondi Prison, about an hour and a half away, far out in the village area. It was a farming prison, and so almost the entire prison would come for Bible study, but this was a new Bible study that we had started on Thursday afternoon. And this is Chikwawa Prison. People ask me, how hot is it in Blantyre? Well, from about end of August to about early March, it would be upwards of low to mid-30s. Chikwawa was always about 10 degrees hotter. And so there would be days I would go down, there would be 45 degrees plus humidity. And they're primarily outside with very little shade. Here you can see us doing a demonstration. I was speaking on trust that day. And would you believe it? This was the third person I needed to convince to come up and trust me. I asked them, do you trust me? Do you trust me? They say, yeah, we trust you, Abusa. Abusa means pastor in Chichewa. And then they'd come up and I'd tell them what I wanted them to do. And they're like, don't trust you that much, and sit back down, right? And so I like this guy. He trusted me. And then on the left is a guy named Rami. He was one of the primary volunteers that I worked with. He was with me all the time, everywhere I went. And he is the one who is continuing this ministry until more people can be brought in. We'll just leave that one up for a moment. But what I was struck in visiting these men was the reality that is often part of the human condition. And that is so often is that our hope, our sense of joy, our sense of satisfaction is often grounded in our external circumstances, in the things that are happening to us, in the people that are with us. And I don't know about you, but then you suddenly get into a bit of a roller coaster ride. When things are going well, then suddenly life seems to be going well. When things suddenly start to take a nosedive, things begin to become much more difficult. And I began to realize there's got to be something more than just basing hope upon what happens to us. The second challenge I realized is that as a white North American stepping into a prison, what do you say to these individuals who have absolutely nothing? Who believe that they have been forgotten by their government, forgotten by their family, and even forgotten by God? It's got to go beyond just the pleasantries. Well, things are going to get better. I couldn't make that guarantee. I couldn't promise them that they were going to get out any sooner. I couldn't promise them that their family members would embrace them. I couldn't promise them these things. And so what do? We talked unapologetically about the hope that we have in God. The reality that hope is based not upon what happens to us, but in knowing who is with us. And stripping away the lie that the circumstances and situations of life determine God's outlook upon you. One of the greatest themes in the Bible is God stepping into people's lives and telling them, you matter. You are not forgotten. And so that's what we did. We visited them regularly. And we provided hope in really two basic ways. One is we went as often as we possibly could. I'd visited 4 prisons a week. We'd be there for about 2.5, 3 hours sometimes, depending on how long they would let us stay. We would do Bible study. We would do one-on-one counseling, which was just basically listening to people, hearing their story, and then praying with them and for them. The other thing we did was 3 times a year we gave distribution. Some of you that were here over Christmas, the generosity of this church was incredible. Over $5,000 was raised by this congregation, which was matched by another $5,000 from our denomination. So I was able to purchase $10,000 worth of basic bed mats, grass mats that we could then lie out in the cells so these men would no longer have to lie on the cement slabs, but would have a little bit of cushion. This is a Chichiri prison. When I handed out the mats, it was incredible to see the sense of excitement. They grabbed these mats literally from our hands and ran outside and rolled them out, and it was like them lying in the most plush mattress ever. When we handed out soap, they would grab the bars of soap and they would immediately go to any type of water source they could find and start washing themselves because it had been weeks since they had a simple bar of soap. Before Easter, we handed out Bibles and hymn books, about 500 each, so that they could actually spend time reading more about the things that we were talking about week to week. Here are blankets that we passed out as well. And then the final picture shows us just in June at Cholo Prison. This is one of the prisons we visited regularly, handing out basic necessities of cleaning supplies, medicine, soap, and food. This past March, the government of Malawi declared a state of emergency because it's the second year that the crops have failed. 80% of Malawi are subsistence farmers. And so when the crops fail, very few people eat. 2 years ago, it was floods. This year, it was a drought. And so you start to see that hope cannot be based upon simply the environment we find ourselves in. There has to be something greater. And so we continually came back to this message of hope that just runs throughout the pages of the Bible. Because guess what? These men in Malawi were not the first people to think that because of what was happening to them, perhaps God had forgotten them. The passage that Jill read this morning comes from the Old Testament by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 49. We're just going to put it up on the screen. This was a time when the people of God, the nation of Israel, were in difficulty. Life was not going as they thought it should. And so what does God do? He sends a prophet into their midst. And a prophet primarily did two things. We often think of prophets as the one who speak about future events, which was an aspect of how God would use them. But the primary role of a prophet was to remind people again of what God had already told them, of how God wanted them to live. And so in the midst of disappointment, in the midst of life not going according to plan, these are the words the prophet says to them. Shout for joy, rejoice, for the Lord comforts his people and will have compassion on the afflicted ones. But what is the people's response? The Lord has forsaken me. The Lord has forgotten me. You see, what was happening for the people of God was they were allowing their circumstances to determine God's reality in their life. They felt as if they had been forgotten. And then listen to what God says to them. He gives them two incredible images. God says, can a mother forget her child? Now that's a pretty significant image, because we know that only in the most dire circumstances would a mother ever depart and leave her child behind. It's almost unfathomable, but we know that it can happen. And God says, even if that is possible, I will not leave you. I will not forget you. And then he gives this incredibly powerful image that makes more sense to us than it did to those other hearers almost 3,000 years ago. He says, I have engraved you in the palms of my hands. Now, for the very first listeners, they would understand this to be fairly significant, because engraving is the equivalent of getting a tattoo. And in their day, as it is in our day, people often get tattoos of names or even portraits of people that are significant to them. It's a way of showing our love and devotion. I mean, you don't get the name of an acquaintance tattooed on your shoulder, right? You get those that are most significant to you tattooed on your body. Well, to take it an even step further, it was typically the practice of people in showing devotion to God or whatever deity they worshiped, of getting that engraved upon their body as well as a sign of love and devotion and honor. And listen to what God is saying. He says, as a sign that I will never forget you, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. But the good thing for us is we see even greater meaning here. Because you jump ahead nearly 800 years later, and Isaiah was brilliant at this, being used by God. He was using a current circumstance to point even closer and closer to the one who gives ultimate hope in life, and that is Jesus Christ. The one who literally showed God's love and devotion by allowing him to be pierced and engraved by the cross. You know, one of the conversations that Jesus had on the cross was by a prisoner who feared that he had been forgotten by God. You may know that Jesus, as he was dying, there was two criminals on either side, both men who deserved to be up there. And one of them mocked Jesus, probably because he looked at his circumstances and says, what can you possibly do for me? Unless you fix my current circumstance, I want nothing to do with you. And the other one says, what are you talking about? Enough. And he turns to Jesus and says, will you remember me? Wanting to be remembered. And what does Jesus say? Today, you will be with me in paradise. That's the hope that we have when we choose to look beyond the circumstances of life to the one who can give and bring ultimate hope into our life. It wasn't easy to go into these prisons on a day-by-day basis. There were challenges, there was difficulties, but the reason that I continued to go was for hope. The hope that I wanted to bring into their lives, not through the words that I could say, but through the promises and the reality of who Jesus was. But there was an exchange, because then I was given hope by them. In Makandi prison, there was a man named Henry who had been sentenced to 4 years because he had gotten into a bar fight and backed up one of his buddies and made a bad decision and probably got more time than he should have. But he was serving the 4 years. He was an engineer. And it seemed as if everything had been wiped away. Yet he was there as not only my translator, but he would have a booklet as well. And he would be scribbling down the notes as I was talking, and then he would translate it. And I was like, I should just let you do this. You're doing it much better. And there'd be times I'd be speaking and I'd be sharing, and he would go on and on and on and on, and I'm like, Henry, what are you doing? He goes, I'm just improving upon what you're saying, Pastor. Maybe some of you are thinking, we should get Henry a plane ticket and bring him here today, right? But because of us simply going and being present and being with them, Henry had says, Joel, when I get out of here, I want to continue to learn. I want to continue to share more and more about Jesus, not only to my family, but I want to come back into prison and tell others about what Jesus can do. I thought, wow, we need more Henrys in this world. Or think about a boy named Chimwemwe. Chimwemwe was in a Vumwe prison about 45 minutes away from where we were, and it was a juvenile prison. It was for youth ages 15 to 21. Chimwemwe's story, his parents died when he was very young. His older brother took care of him, but then when he got married, he left and went to live in the village of where his new family was going to be. And so here is Chimwemwe as a 15-year-old boy trying to figure out life on his own. There was a robbery in his village, and the thieves stashed what they had stolen under Chimwemwe's porch at his house. Now, we're not talking jewelry or cash. We're talking about vegetables and chickens. Cost him 4 years. 4 years. And so at the end of one of our conversations, he came up to me through a translator and says, I just need to forgive, and I don't know how. But can you just pray for me? And you start to see the reality of the hope that they start to hold on to. Because these guys have nothing. And yet they are willing to live with a sense of joy and hope that wasn't always a reality in my life. And that's when I was reminded again that hope is not based upon what happens to us. It's based upon who we know is living with us. And so the question that faces us this morning is, do you have that hope? Do you have that reality? Because we live in a world of brokenness. We may not be in prison, but we live in a world of brokenness where we put our hope in jobs and then we lose our jobs. We put a hope in a relationship and the relationship gets broken. We put our hope in other things, in our health and in our fitness, and then suddenly that is taken from us. There has to be something more. And that's why Jesus came. To give us hope that goes beyond the circumstances into a greater reality that no matter what we face, we know that He is with us and He will give us the strength and the comfort to continue to carry on. And so if you're someone this morning who is just wrestling with these questions, we are so grateful that you're here this morning. As I said earlier, on Sunday mornings, we are all about learning more about who Jesus is and what that means to change our lives. So it's not just a head knowledge, it's a heart knowledge. It's a heart reality. And so take it a further step. If you're someone who does have this hope, are you living it out? Is it a reality in your life? Because Jesus didn't come to make us smarter and wiser. He came so that we, through him, would change the world. And I have seen it in prisons. I have heard testimonies from guards of saying the level of the attitude and the level of violence has changed. And we say, well, why do you think that is? They say, because you keep showing up every week and talking about a guy named Jesus. The early church grew. They were persecuted. They were vulnerable. They were on the margins. And God worked in their life in such an incredible way that people took notice and wanted to be like them. So they needed to have who they had. Think of the difference that could be made not only in our lives, but in our families, in our communities, in this world. If we lived the reality of this hope, of knowing that God is with us, that you're so important, that Jesus would engrave us on the palms of his hands. And so this week, perhaps as a bit of just a mental reminder, when you're washing your hands or when you're rubbing your hands or when you're trying to get the sweat off your hands or scrub the dirt off your children's hands, look at your hands and be reminded that you can never be forgotten. You will always be remembered because Jesus has engraved you in the palms of his hands. And that gives us hope. That gives us hope. Please stand with me as we sing together.